posted February 28, 2019, 6 hours 0 minutes and 2 seconds. The NSW government's refusal to join the National Violence Prevention Agency Our Watch has mystified and frustrated family violence advocates who say it is one of several indicators the Berejiklian government is not serious about tackling the scourge of domestic abuse. Our Watch was established in 2013 to drive nationwide change in the cultures, behaviors and power imbalances that lead to violence against women by working with members to implement its prevention strategies and initiatives. But the NSW government remains the only state or territory government that is not a member, despite the urging of the Domestic Violence Death Review Team, which makes recommendations to prevent domestic violence-related homicides and suicides. It has also refused to provide an explanation as to why it won't join, with advocates reporting they have never been given an adequate response, despite fierce lobbying from frontline workers and the labor opposition. Now, as the state prepares to head to the polls, a coalition of domestic violence peak bodies and service providers is calling on all political parties to back a series of primary prevention initiatives, including establishing an independent body for preventing gender-based violence, becoming a member of Our Watch, and rolling out respectful relationships education in schools. No prioritization of domestic violence is part of their campaign, A Safe State. The NSW Women's Alliance is also calling on the government to urgently boost funding for specialist domestic violence services, including women's refuges, which are still struggling to meet surging demand, and having to turn away vulnerable women and children years after advocates first raised the alarm. I and others in the domestic violence sector have been mystified as to why there has been a resistance from the NSW government to joining Our Watch, said Balch, chief executive of Domestic Violence NSW, one of the founders of A Safe State, which launched late last year. The feedback we've had very consistently from our practitioners in the field is that there is an absolute need for NSW to be working to the national prevention framework and initiatives that sit alongside it. Ms. Balch said the government had designed its own prevention and early intervention strategies in 2017, and there were bits and pieces of really good work being done as a result, but that there was a lack of coordination of those projects, relatively little funding for communities to undertake prevention activities, and a lack of alignment with prevention approaches being undertaken in other jurisdictions. When you think about what violence against women is costing NSW, an estimated $6 billion a year, according to KPMG, it just astonishes me that we are unable to invest a tiny slice of that in what is supposed to be the National Prevention Organization, she said, adding, "We have never been given an adequate response as to why we haven't joined Our Watch. We are the richest and most populous state in the country. And when you look at what we spend money on, for example, the Berejiklian government's plans to spend more than $1 billion on stadiums, it shows there is just no prioritization of domestic violence with our current government." Domestic violence advocates, frustrated, disappointed. This is not the first time the government has been urged to address the cultural drivers of domestic abuse, or that its budget for domestic violence services and programs has come under fire. In its most extensive review to date, the NSW Domestic Violence Death Review Team analyzed 14 years of domestic violence homicide data in 2017, including 204 cases where a person was killed by a current or former partner. In its final report, it made 36 recommendations, the first of which was that the NSW government give consideration to becoming a member of Our Watch, and that the Death Review Team Secretariat work together with Our Watch to analyze media reporting around murder-suicides in NSW and disseminate its research findings. In its official response, the government rejected the recommendation, saying it was committed to the prevention of violence against women and children, however does not intend to become a member of Our Watch. Haley Foster, director of the Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Service (WDVCAS), which is also part of the NSW Women's Alliance, said she was incredibly frustrated by the government's decision not to join. "We're disappointed because we know the research says the principal drivers of gender-based violence are gender inequality, disrespectful attitudes towards women and girls, and rigid stereotypes and ideas around gender roles. So we would like to see a comprehensive approach to tackling that the Council of Australian Governments can work on together, Ms. Foster told ABC News. NSW should also develop its own statutory body that is charged with developing and implementing a strategy for cultural change that works hand in glove with our watch. It's important that we're all part of the same cultural change story. NSW, behind the 8 ball, on primary prevention. NSW Labour has pledged to join our watch and deliver respectful relationships education in schools if it is elected in March, with the opposition spokeswoman for the prevention of domestic and family violence and sexual assault Jenny Aitchison arguing NSW had absolutely been behind the 8 ball in primary prevention work. We know violence is intergenerational and that if it's not nipped in the bud early, it becomes an endless cycle, Ms. Aitchison said. At every age, women who have reported experiencing domestic violence have poorer health outcomes. Domestic violence is a massive predictor for disadvantage and homelessness, so it's crucial that we're tackling this at that primary prevention level. A spokeswoman for the NSW government did not respond to specific questions from ABC News about why the government had refused to join our watch, or whether it would respond to the calls for action of a safe state. However, she said the government's approach to tackling domestic violence in NSW was making a real difference and we are seeing results not replicated in other states. Our investment of more than $390 million over 4 years in specialist domestic violence initiatives will support victim survivors to rebuild their lives and hold perpetrators to account, the spokeswoman said. This investment is in addition to the hundreds of millions of dollars the government spends each year to combat domestic and family violence through mainstream services in justice, health, police, child protection, social housing and homelessness. The government was also investing in frontline services, research, prevention and early intervention, she said, and had launched a $20 million innovation fund, supporting 20 new projects. There is always more work to be done, and we will continue to provide record investment, more support and accommodation options to victims of domestic and family violence. In comparison, the Victorian government is spending more than $2 billion over 4 years to prevent and respond to family violence, which it announced following the state's Royal Commission into Family Violence. Victims' access to services depends on your postcode. Notably, the latest domestic violence victimization data suggests there has been a drop in some forms of domestic violence in NSW in the past decade. An analysis published by BOCSAR last year found the victimization rate for physical domestic violence declined between 2010 and 2014, though this was followed by a period of stabilization in the following 4 years to 2018. Meanwhile, recorded crime data from NSW police also showed a statistically significant decrease in the rate of domestic violence assaults occasioning grievous bodily harm, down from 5.8 incidents per 100,000 in 2009 to 4.9 per 100,000 in 2016. But while BOCSAR said the results gave it confidence that there had been a real change in the prevalence of domestic violence in NSW, the reasons for the reduction were unclear, and not attributable to the government's domestic violence reforms. The outgoing Minister for the Prevention of Domestic and Family Violence and Sexual Assault, Prue Goward, recently pointed to these figures as evidence that her strategy to focus on perpetrator accountability, through tougher policing and setting a target to reduce domestic violence reoffending by 25% by 2021, was having an impact. When she began in her role in 2011, Ms. Goward told the Sydney Morning Herald last month, NSW was considered a bit of an embarrassment. Back then, we were just so soft on perpetrators, they were invisible. What other crime is the perpetrator not central to your efforts, except domestic violence and sexual assault, she said. In armed robbery do we spend 90% of our efforts on the victim, but some advocates say the government's recent investments in perpetrator interventions, while a step in the right direction, have been insufficient, and have come at the expense of much-needed services and support for survivors. "There is just not enough investment in any part of the domestic violence service system," said Ms. Balch, who is concerned that some programs, such as Staying Home Leaving Violence, which allows women and children to remain in their home instead of fleeing, or underfunded and still not available in many parts of the state. "We have a fragmented service system in NSW, because we fund trials and pilots and short-term initiatives, but they are rarely joined up or expanded. This means the response you receive as a victim survivor, what support you are able to access, very much depends on what your postcode is. The government is responsible for raping the domestic violence sector. Of particular concern to many are the ongoing impacts of the government's widely criticized Going Home Staying Home reforms, which new research suggests have had devastating consequences for women and children escaping violence. Under the 2014 overhaul, individual homelessness and specialist domestic violence refuges were consolidated following a competitive tendering process, with many smaller, locally run refuges being forced into partnership with larger services, many of which lacked expertise in working with women and families impacted by violence. According to official government accounts, the process, which aimed to centralize and improve access to homelessness services, has been largely successful. The NSW government spokeswoman told ABC News the number of refuges had increased from 76 in 2014 to 82, while the Staying Home Leaving Violence program had been expanded to 32 sites. But frontline staff and advocacy groups say the reforms have resulted in dozens of specialist women's refuges closing or being converted into generic homelessness responses, some of which accommodate not just family violence victims, but also women and men with complex needs. Prior to the reform, if you got into a women's refuge, you knew it was going to be staffed by workers who understood the issues that women escaping domestic violence face, so they understood the safety issues but also how to navigate really complex legal and service systems, said the University of Sydney's Susan Heward-Bell, who is preparing to publish the findings of her study of the impacts of Going Home Staying Home. The research, to be published imminently, involved in-depth interviews with 15 workers who were employed in NSW refuges before and after the reforms. Now, Dr. Heward-Bell said, women are finding that if they can even get into a refuge, which are consistently full, they're not always assisted by specialist staff and may be placed with people who have substance abuse or serious mental health issues. As a result, she said, most participants reported that they had worked with women who decided to go back to abusive partners or sleep in their car because their experiences in generic homelessness shelters had compounded their trauma and put their children at further risk of harm. To me, there's an irony in the fact that in 2019, we probably have more information than we've ever had about how domestic violence can affect children, and yet we commensurately have fewer services for those children, Dr. Heward-Bell said. Another problem participants talked about was how decimated the connections between workers and agencies in the sector were as a result of the competitive tender process. It basically resulted in people not talking to each other anymore, people just competing for scraps to be able to run their service, which left them feeling disempowered, and that the hard-fought wins of feminists before them had been lost. As one participant said, I don't say this lightly, but the government is responsible for raping the domestic violence sector, the community sector. Labor announces $158 million package largely for this reason. The NSW Women's Alliance is now asking parties to commit an additional $310 million over 4 years for specialist family violence services that provide crisis accommodation, counseling and ongoing case management, in addition to dozens of other calls for action and funding for domestic and sexual violence reform. The impacts of Going Home Staying Home have been felt across the board in the homelessness sector, though not just within the refuges, Ms. Balch said. The refuge crisis system is a really key part of our response, but so are the longer-term services, for example specialist trauma counseling for women who are escaping violence, flexible financial assistance and access to long short-term affordable housing. NSW Labor this week announced a $158 million package to address domestic and sexual violence if elected, in addition to its previous promise to join our watch and deliver respectful relationships education. This includes $80 million over 4 years for specialist refuges and housing, $6.8 million for the NSW Rape Crisis Center, and funding for 29 caseworkers for WDVCAS. It also pledged to shift the portfolio into the Premier's department, with the Premier to deliver an annual statement on the government's progress. Labour is making the prevention of domestic violence a key commitment, and I will bring responsibility for this issue into the heart of government, within the Premier's department, NSW Labour leader Michael Daly said. Ms. Foster, who is calling for $30 million over 4 years to fund 61 additional WDVCAS caseworkers, said Labour's announcement had been warmly received by a sector in desperate need of funding. The reality is, however, that it represents just 10% of the funding envelope accompanying the Safe State Reform Platform, she said. If we really want to end domestic, family and sexual violence, we need to see the next government commit to a funding package which is more commensurate with the cost that this scourge has to our communities, and if it doesn't, said Ms. Balch, the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence was very clear that if you keep underfunding services and forcing organizations to competitively tender to deliver what should be really fundamental services across the state, then in a few years' time we're still going to be dealing with the same levels of violence and the same ambulance at the bottom of the cliff crises we're dealing with now. Good governments put the most vulnerable citizens at the top of their list of priorities. It's time for NSW leaders to step up. Topics: domestic violence, family and children, homelessness, welfare, women, social policy, state elections. NSW